Originally, the Unitarian and the Universalist sides of our heritage were theologically liberal branches of Protestant Christianity that emphasized Jesus' life, his teachings, his ethics. They increasingly taught that Jesus wanted others not to worship him, but to follow him, to emulate his way of self-giving love. As our UU slogans go, we are a religion of deeds, not creeds, of salvation by character. We are saved from ourselves by how we treat others, as opposed, as the Red Queen told Alice, of needing to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. As the Unitarians and the Universalists grew closer and eventually consolidated in 1961 to form the Unitarian Universalist Association, they became an increasingly big tent religion. The original emphasis on the Jewish and Christian teachings expanded widely to a robust pluralism that we know today in our 6 sources. And those 6 sources and our 7 principles are printed on the back of each week's order of service. Additionally, I've heard the argument made that we should perhaps add a 7th source, our UU history and heritage. We are much more than a newfangled religion that started in the 1960s. Not that there's anything wrong with things that started in the 60s. But it's significant to recognize that the roots of our Unitarian heritage go back to the 1500s in Europe, and our Universalist roots go back to the 1700s right here in North America. And if you travel through New England, you will find Unitarian congregations that are well more than 300 years old. Our theological ancestors courageously demanded that the Bible be interpreted in light of reason, cutting-edge science, and what they knew to be true in their own first-hand experience. It's no coincidence that the Protestant Reformation began in the early 1500s, about 50 years after Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, so that finally people had copies of the books for themselves, and they began to find that it didn't say what they had been told it said. What they discovered conflicted with centuries of tradition, creeds, and liturgy. Likewise, going back to the 1700s in North America, a time when there was widespread anxiety in the years before the U.S. Revolutionary War, there was widespread anxiety about whether oneself, one's friends, one's family were predestined to an eternal torment in the afterlife. Our Universalist ancestors in such an environment began preaching a message of universal salvation for all people based on love. And eventually our focus became not on salvation in the next world, but on loving the hell out of this world. So while I deeply appreciate our 6 sources, we also have more than 5 centuries of Unitarian history and more than 2 centuries of Universalist history that we can also draw from for support. Ancestors of courage, conscience, and conviction that can inspire our work today in building the beloved community. I've been thinking about our Unitarian history and heritage a lot in recent months in preparation for co-teaching a course this spring at Wesley Theological Seminary in D.C. on UU history and polity. Polity comes from that Greek word polis for city, related to the word politics, so it's just how we organize ourselves, our governance. And while I will by no means make you sit through all the hours of lectures and the stacks of books that are required of our seminarians, although I do appreciate that some of you would actually enjoy that, I will be inviting you this spring and this winter to experience just a few more sermons than I normally would that draw from what I'm calling our 7th source, our UU history and heritage, because I want to share with you some of the best of what I'm learning. And if history is not your favorite subject, there'll be other topics, as of course, this winter and spring. But my hope is that you'll increasingly come to see our UU history and heritage as a source of wisdom and a source of guidance in our work today. That, as Carol read earlier, we did not create ourselves. We stand on the shoulders of giants. One reason that I'm starting this morning with Joseph Priestley is that we are in the subdivision of the UUA known as the Joseph Priestley District. Now that may soon be merged into the Central East Regional Group if you want to get nerdy about our polity, but for now we are still the Joseph Priestley District. So maybe it's more timely than ever before we may no longer be the Joseph Priestley District. And we named our district after Priestley because of his influence in spreading Unitarianism right here, especially in Pennsylvania, not far from here, in this area. And although he was raised in a strict Calvinist family, by his early 20s he was a free-thinking minister-scientist, unafraid to experiment with both theology and science. And if this sermon leaves you interested in learning more, there's a relatively recent 2-volume biography by Robert Schofield by Penn State University Press about Priestley's life. That weighs in at about 800 pages, so if you're looking for something a little less formidable, there's a much more accessible introduction to Priestley called The Invention of Air that's only about 200 pages and is targeted at a popular audience and is a pretty fun read. Although Priestley's name is less well known today, he was quite influential in his own time. To just name one example, among the 165 letters that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson wrote, they had a big rift in their friendship, and toward the end of their life they began exchanging letters. And of those 165 letters, Benjamin Franklin is mentioned by name 5 times. George Washington got 3 mentions. Their mutual nemesis, Alexander Hamilton, was mentioned twice. Priestley, an Englishman who spent only the last decade of his life in the U.S., is mentioned 52 times. Priestley always wanted to share his insights widely. When the English scientist Isaac Newton, and this was kind of the standard at the time, wrote his landmark book on the mathematical principles of natural philosophy in 1687, he wrote in Latin. In contrast, less than a century later, when Priestley published his highly influential The History and Present State of Electricity with Original Experiments, he wrote in English because he wanted his book to be accessible. He also intentionally shaped his book with the goal of inspiring readers. He was extra detailed about the experiments in history and that he was doing himself with electricity because he wanted people to see, you can be a scientist too. This is this trajectory, this is where we are now, and then he sort of outlined, these are things that need to be done. You can do this too and help us advance knowledge. He was also fully transparent with his own discoveries, and he was transparent that they weren't a work of genius. It was really more a matter of trial and error. He was sort of a kitchen sink scientist. He just tried absolutely everything and then saw what worked. And speaking of experimentation without the guarantee of positive results, that story that's well known of Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a thunderstorm, that comes from Priestley's History of Electricity. Franklin himself had only briefly published a third-person account of his experiment in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and he hadn't even said that it was his. He just talked about this thing that happened. But he willingly gave Priestley extensive details. Unfortunately, Priestley's full transparency meant that he was a much better scientist than he was an entrepreneur. For example, he discovered a method of infusing carbonation into water, so creating carbonated water. Think of the untold trillions of dollars that have been generated by the invention of soda water. Yet Priestley happily revealed his formula in letters, in pamphlets, in dinner party conversations to anyone who would listen. A certain Johann Schweppes fared better in this regard, patenting a method of carbonating water in 1783. You've perhaps heard of Schweppes ginger ale, Schweppes tonic water. There's a reason you haven't heard of Priestley ginger ale. Priestley's openness certainly helped advance science, but wasn't always the best for his family's bank account. Now, there are many more fascinating details to trace about Priestley's scientific discovery, but for this morning, allow me to focus on perhaps the most famous, what Johnson calls the invention of air. The story begins in childhood when, as an 11-year-old boy, Priestley discovered, as young children sometimes do, that if you trap an insect in a sealed jar, it will eventually die. Showing an early penchant for the scientific method and not having an ethics committee to answer to, the 11-year-old Priestley, in an effort to understand, okay, why did that just happen? Why did that insect die? He began closely observing precisely how long it took different spiders to die when he trapped them in a jar. Now, this was around 1744, before either the American or French Revolution, and to appreciate the context, it's important to try to set aside all of the scientific insights that we take for granted here in the early 21st century, 300 years later. At that time, no one knew why insects die, or why do candles extinguish when they're sealed inside a glass jar. Did the creatures somehow exhaust the air that they were breathing? In that case, what was left in the jar? Or were they poisoning the environment with an invisible substance that they released? Or was some other factor at work? Before Priestley, for the most part, people thought of the space between objects as essentially nothingness. Now, we know that's not the case now. They just thought this is nothingness. So that was the paradigm with which Priestley was working. Fast forwarding almost 30 years, as an adult, Priestley picked back up on that line of experimentation he had first begun with those spiders as an 11-year-old boy. The variation that occurred to him was what would happen if instead of a spider or a candle, he substituted a plant. In late spring, he pulled some mint from his garden, and he fully expected it to wilt and die in a matter of days or weeks, but something strange and unexpected happened. The plant stubbornly refused to die and continued growing all summer. For any young people here this morning, think of this as one of the best science fair projects ever. So simple, but with incredibly profound results. The mysteries then began compounding. He found that a candle would readily burn in the jar along with the mint. And although modern animal rights activists would not approve of what the Priestley's method that I'm about to share with you, he also discovered that a mouse placed inside the jar with the plant could happily survive about 10 minutes or so, while a mouse placed in a plant-free jar in which another mouse had previously expired would begin to convulse within seconds. Now, don't worry, here ended the animal cruelty section of this morning's sermon. The next insight that Priestley had was to leave the mint plant sealed in a jar with a candle. When the candle burned out, he knew for sure that no more wholesome air remained in the jar. But 10 days later, when he went to light another candle in the glass, it burned perfectly well. It seemed that plants were restoring something fundamental to the air, or they were creating the air itself. Excitingly, the results were the same each time he repeated the experiment, 8 to 10 times. Johnson writes that with knowing the 21st century's universe story, we know that reaching back 13.8 billion years and reaching down to the microscopic world of bacteria and molecules, that would have been almost entirely off limits to Priestley and to his friend and his correspondence partner, Benjamin Franklin. But both men had a hunch that something profound was lurking in the mint's survival in that closed, sealed glass jar. And we can see here the first stirrings of a genuinely new way of thinking about life on Earth and our role in that system. The air we breathe is not some inalienable fact of life on Earth like gravity or magnetism, but is rather something specifically manufactured by plants. And that manufacture is itself part of a vast interconnected system that links plants and animals and invisible gases in a rational flow that we can come to learn and trace and systematize. And the choices we make as humans can have a dangerous impact on that flow. As a result of his work, he was awarded the Copley Medal, which was the Nobel Prize of his time. It was awarded by the Royal Society of London on account of the many curious and useful experiments confined in his observations of the different kinds of air. Now, I've spent a fair amount of time tracing one of Priestley's scientific discoveries, and I'll likely preach another sermon maybe in a few years about more of Priestley's life and more about his contributions to Unitarian theology. But part of my point for this morning is that the questions, the wonder, the curiosity of science that Priestley brought to his exploration of the world, that is equally worthy of our reflection here on Sunday morning as his theological investigations. Along those lines, it's significant that Priestley brought the same scientific rigor and empiricism that he used in the laboratory to both politics and to theology. 2 years after his discovery of oxygen, in the introduction to his observations on air, he said, "This rapid progress of knowledge will, I doubt not, be the means of extirpating all error and prejudice, and of putting an end to all undue and usurped authority in the business of religion as well as science. The English hierarchy, if there be anything unsound in its constitution, has equal reason to tremble at the air pump or the electrical machine." He challenged that all fields, science, politics, religion, and more, must face the scrutiny of reason and experience. And to tell you just a brief few highlights about the religious side of his life. Priestley was a minister most of his life, and slightly intimidatingly, all those scientific discoveries he made, winning the equivalent of the Nobel Prize, that's what he did in his free time. Though I'm not sure he spent actually that much time being a minister, that's a separate discussion, but his experiments were again conducted in his leisure time. And in 1772, 2 years after Priestley had won that Copley Medal, when Theophilus Lindsay led the first Unitarian worship service in England, so he changed the Book of Common Prayer to eliminate all the Trinitarian references and led the first Unitarian worship service in England, Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Priestley were among the 200 people gathered in the congregation for that first service in the Essex Street Chapel in London. Almost a decade later, Priestley published a book titled History of the Corruptions of Christianity that criticized these later corruptions. He wanted to get back to the beginnings, and he criticized corruptions like the Trinity in order to restore a focus on Jesus' original ethics and teachings, which to him were the whole point. This book helped inspire Thomas Jefferson. There's a copy of it in Jefferson's library that's in the Library of Congress. It helped inspire Jefferson to create what we call today the Jefferson Bible, in which he applied reason and his own experience to the Bible to cut out all the parts, the supernatural parts that he didn't think made sense in the modern age. Jefferson later wrote to John Adams, "I have read Priestley's Corruptions of Christianity and Early Opinions of Jesus over and over again, and I rest on them as the basis of my own faith. These writings have never been answered." Each week I begin our service by saying that we seek to draw wisdom from all the world's religions, balanced with the insights of modern science. And our theological ancestors, such as Priestley, can be vital inspirations for us today and for future generations as we seek to live ever more fully into our fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, as we seek to live into our fifth source, humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science. The Greek root of the word heretic simply means to choose, horesis, to choose. It means someone who chooses for him or herself what to believe instead of allowing a hierarchy or a tradition, this secondhand knowledge, instead of allowing that to determine what you will believe or to choose for you. Priestley died in 1804 at the age of 70, but before then, his old friend Benjamin Franklin wrote in a letter to a mutual acquaintance, "Remember me affectionately to the honest heretic, Dr. Priestley." "Do not, however, mistake me," Franklin continued. "It is not to my good friend's heresy that I impute his honesty. On the contrary, 'tis his honesty that brought upon him the character of heretic. It is his honesty, his demand that we rely not on what others have allegedly told us is the truth, but that we test for ourselves what the truth actually is. That has brought upon Priestley the character of heretic, the character of one who chooses for him or herself." May it be so for us. When faced with secondhand information that we discover to be untrue, may we listen to that still, small voice of conscience and be honest to what we know is true, to what we have tested in the crucible of our own first-hand experience. May the honest heretics that shape our living tradition be the legacy that we too hand on to future generations. May we choose for ourselves with integrity and with authenticity. I invite you to take now about a minute of silence to reflect on that legacy of honest heresy. In a few moments, I'll invite us to share together about the difference between first-hand knowledge and 2 Timothy.